Can you hear? Yeah. Okay. Today is a very special day for me. The first time I met Professor Dengel was in 2006. Back then, I was a student at the chair of artificial intelligence at the University of Würzburg, and Professor Dengel gave a very inspiring speech and a presentation about also the blurring line between science fiction and reality. And this is the topic of today's talk. So, you know, we all read, watch, and hear a lot of, stranger-than-life stories about AI. If you hear such a story and without consulting Google, how would you establish for yourself whether it is science fiction or science fact?
Interesting question, Nabil. Yeah, I think it mostly depends on the reader. Yeah, so I'm frequently giving talks to an audience where the audience is so impressed about what we already work on. For them, it's science fiction. Yeah, if you are an experienced AI researcher, yeah, it's quite a bit more easy. However, you know, all these methods nowadays which are available, which can fake, even pictures or videos, you know, face-to-face or Lyrebird, where the voices are changed. So reading stories about something without having any hint to the background is quite hard to see whether they are true or not.
So, but are there special criteria like you would apply? For example, if it was a story where the robot has emotions, has complex cognitive abilities, would you say of course it's science fiction? We're not capable of developing this kind of, sophisticated, strong artificial intelligence yet.
I think, as I mentioned before in my talk, I think, well, if you talk about or ask a computer to recognize pattern in data, which is maybe a short form of machine learning, then everything which is real can be recognized, but it depends on data. So a computer nowadays is an excellent pattern recognizer, but a computer AI system has no idea about the impact of what is done. It has not an idea about, as I told, the language or what is inside a picture and where it is and under what circumstances it is done. So to really have this way of feeling of consciousness, it's lacking, but it's an excellent aid for us nowadays. But in these stories, I would doubt about having a robot with really compassion aspects or any emotions.
So that's interesting. So recently I read a story about an experiment which has been done at the University of Duisburg-Essen, and they had, now robots. I think these robots are being produced in France. They are those cute small robots, and it was a psychological experiment. So you had a pair of subjects and a subject and a robot, and they did a game together, and they had question-answer session, and they established some relationship between the robot and the human being. And then after that, the instructor asked the humans to switch off the robot, and the robot began begging the humans not to switch them off. And the humans struggled with this decision.
Sure.
And it's very interesting. Like, people, of course, didn't know that these reactions were not spontaneous, but they were pre-programmed. But why do you think, why is it so difficult for researchers, for companies to develop and implement this kind of complex emotions, or emotions in general, complex cognitive processes? This is what every human being can do very easily. Why is it so difficult to implement these things?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think this behavior of humans is very typical because they always tend, if something behaves like themselves, they tend to have this compassion attitude, where they consider even a robot as a human-like being. And but if you look what makes a human, it's the ability to have this compassion. So we can only say on one hand side, there's an answer. In our brain we have mirror neurons, They are part of the motor cortex. And there is this location, the side where compassion sits. And if we have someone talking to, or looking in the face, he mimics and gestures. This neurons start vibrations, and they are not only recognizing what our opposite is doing, but rather also feel it on the body. And this is different for every single human. Yeah? So it's quite hard to provide an objective way to transfer this, even we have no model, to a machine. And moreover, it's not just electronic impulse, which is important, which is basically the concept of artificial neurons. It's also hormones. It's enzymes, which play a certain role. And we have no idea how to combine those aspects in the real working set.
So let me quote Morpheus from The Matrix. He said, "What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain." So do you think that we will ever be able to, replicate, the sense of smell, emotions, feelings?
Well, if you look to our brain, only a few % of our brain is a linear structure of neurons. So the visual cortex, for example, has 8 layers, and we are able to simulate the visual cortex. The auditive is very similar, and even build a more deeper artificial neural network to do that. But most of our brain, more than 95%, is relational. And even nowadays, we understand somehow the brain, but the deeper we try to understand the brain, the more questions arise. Because it's very, very complex, and it behaves a bit different for each individual. Therefore, simulating, feelings, emotions, it's possible. Of course, something which can be measured, can be modeled, and therefore computed. So therefore, we can also partially simulate it on a computer. But even nowadays, we have neural networks which are excellent in seeing, excellent in hearing, excellent in tactile aspects. But even the multimodality, to combine this, is a challenge. We have no idea how to fuse the data, early, late, or in between. They are still in an experimental setting to find good solutions. But the complexity which is taking place, if we have this compassion and this emotions, hate, love, fear, all these aspects, it's too complex from my point of view to build something equivalent on a machine.
So that's very interesting. So moving on from the limitations of artificial intelligence to the limitations of science fiction itself as a discipline. What we were talking about before that is known as strong AI. That is the idea of having, artificial machines capable of feeling, capable of developing complex cognitive abilities. And as you said, I agree with you totally, of course, that it is now more in the realm of science fiction than in anywhere near being science fact. But despite that, if you look at the public debate, if you look at how we view AI, also in our political debate, my feeling is that this debate is heavily driven by the strong AI hypothesis. You have always reading articles about how robots might subjugate humans, how they might control us, and so on. Why do you think this is the case?
Yeah, well, this is true. Even the bicentennial man, which is a positive example in AI, you mentioned it before when we talked about it, is a relationship to strong AI, even if it's not negative. But you are basically right. Most of the things are shown in a negative way caused by AI, and why is that? I think if you look at researchers who are experiencing or investigating this aspect of human beings, like Hans Rosling, he's a Swedish professor for international health, He published a book called Factfulness, if I'm right or remembering. And he asked about 12,000 people in many countries about how they estimate the facts. And most of the people, less than 7%, were right in the estimation. Most of the people were too negative. And this negative attitude is inherent for us, maybe specifically for Germans. Sometimes I think so. But basically, I think the negative messages can be sold in a better way. And this is even amplified and maybe accelerated by the internet, because the way of communicating in the internet is also addressing the solidarization of people. Yeah? People tend also, if they have negative messages, to come together and talk also in a more negative aspect about it. But I think we need a turnaround in Germany, because, as I told you, all these science fiction stories are somehow inspiring. I have to state this. But in many aspects, they are not representing the reality. And AI is so rich and so strong and could transform our society in a much better situation.
Right. You know, at the Big Data AI Summit, we have also a blog on science fiction, and when we sent our call for speakers, a lot of people send us abstracts to consider. The interesting thing for me was that even these abstracts coming from guys working at companies, they were also negative. They were about how, you know, scenarios where AI might control or influence human behavior in a negative way. And as you said, the movie Bicentennial Man, played by Robin Williams, which is based on a story by Isaac Asimov, is, for me, the only example I could find, positive example of AI in the popular media. And to summarize the story, it plays in 2005, and it's about a family that bought a robot. The robot is a humanoid robot called Andrew, and the family, you know, became very intrigued by his complex cognitive abilities, and you know, they gave him a lot of books to read about history, ethics, history, and science. And then he started developing emotions, and 200 years later, he fell in love with the granddaughter of his deceased master, and they got married and lived happily ever after. Sorry for spoiling the story. But I ask myself, imagine that we had this kind of, even if it's strong AI, but imagine if we had this kind of positive spin on AI in our public discourse. What do you think? How would the discourse change? What would be possible that's currently not possible?
I think, first of all, we have to inform people what is AI. Most people say, don't know, don't understand, no one can explain, maybe move on. Yeah, this is the situation I can find in many companies. Decision makers have no relationship to AI. So I think it's very important to make it graspable, to make it easy to understand what is possible, what is AI, what are the limitations, what could I do with AI.
How would you define the limitations? That's interesting.
Yeah, well, the limitations are, as we already discussed, given by the fact that the AI system is only able to do that what it is trained for. Yeah, it can do nothing else, so it's mostly data consistent in a certain domain. Sometimes you can do transfer learning, but also only for the same type of data. But I think it's quite important to influence this attitude towards AI through public media, by also convincing journalists and media to show the good examples of AI, and we have many of them in Germany. Of course, as I also mentioned, negative messages are better to be sold, and therefore the media is more hungry for the negative aspects to increase their numbers of well, clicks or whatever. But we should work on this.
Do you have a favorite science fiction book on AI or sci-fi in general?
Yes, something which I read recently, or not recently, 2 years ago, is from Tom Hillenbrand, Throneland. Maybe you know?
No, but you can summarize the story.
Yeah, thinking about a amazing computing power, and everyone is walking around with Google Class something like that, and is recording the environment. And we are fusing all the pixels of all the people together to build up a real-time virtual space of everything. So if you are an investigator, the police, you can, in real time, visit a place to see what happens. And then investigate the cases. It's playing, of course, in the future, but the story is quite nice and also shows some aspect what might come in the future.
Do you think it would be possible someday to do something like this? Or do you have anything currently that's being done that relates to?
Sure.
Yeah?
It's already possible. I think many companies, many OEMs in building for autonomous cars, but also in cultural heritage, they are trying to use cameras to establish 3D representations of the real world. Some of them only need 2 pictures. Even face recognition is now taking some pictures. If you move your head, some few pictures are possible to reproduce your face as 3D, but to measure everything, we now have also new satellites for 3D representation, everything for the European mission. And step by step, yes, but the resolution is quite low, not as in this book, where we have a good real-time rendering with a good resolution.
Could you mention some examples, real-life examples of things that we here might consider to be science fiction, but which are already happening, which are already science facts?
Sure. On one hand side, one interesting topic is now to really combine the model-based aspects of AI with the data-driven ones. That you have an answer and you want to know the question, meaning that you want to understand in what context the data is generated. And the same also holds to open up, in combination with that, the black box of deep neural networks. Yeah, if you have a car and the car decides to ram a person instead of another parking car, you want to know why. Yeah, and now we are at the edge where we open up this black box to explain how decisions are made, what data is responsible for the decision making, and how the decisions are transported or made through the computation layer by layer in the network. This is done by just looking at the gradients and combine them in a certain mathematical form, backward and forward, and then see how the filters in this network act and what are the important filters for decision making. This is also one step towards engineering of deep neural networks, that you got aware of how they work for certain data types and on certain data, and which will lead to a better understanding in the future.
So what you're talking about is, of course, kind of transparency of neural networks, right? Like it's not a black box anymore.
It's not only transparency, not only visualization of what's going on. We recently developed a method which is taking complex time series as input, finding anomalies, and then explaining in natural text why these anomalies are found and from which data they are caused. So which means that the network will be able, the AI system, to explain in natural text about its decision making and action.
You mentioned one of the applications of this kind of neural networks. Can you think maybe of 2 other applications that might be interesting?
In medicine.
Medicine, okay.
Also, if you have all these bias cases in finances, where we had a German lady, who went in front of justice because she got not the money from the bank because the data was biased. All these discrimination aspects could be also unfold because you can see decision making is like this because of that. So it unfolds the data limits and the data bias, maybe by explanation.
And looking into the future, what scenario do you think will be reality in 2030?
This is about 10 years from now. So my hope is that in 10 years, we have a sandbox of trained neural networks, which is available for smart and medium-sized companies, easy to understand, with some consultants who are explaining maybe if it's could not be understood, but it's easy to be used for any company, and the barrier of AI is fallen down, so that we have a widespread use of AI systems with trained models which are provided, for example, through funded projects from the government, because I'm a fan of inventing a new reporting system for the results. Maybe the trained models, not the data. Data could be left with the industry, but the trained models should be made public to be used by others, to be then maybe also be applied for transfer learning and other stuff.
Do you think this would transform businesses if they had more access
Sure.
to?
Yeah, so in Germany we have a few centers only, and you might have heard that our government reduces the budget for AI from 3 billion to 500 million, which is a pity, since, well, DFKI can, of course, somehow still profit from it, but we need AI everywhere. So we need also at the universities, which don't play a very important role, some funding to bring AI to the entire German states, into the not big cities only, so where everyone is able to get in touch with AI.
And looking even farther ahead, so let's say 2050, what do you think will be possible? What are you most excited about?
This is quite hard to really tell, because the development is so dynamic. And anyway, but I think looking at the demographic development and seeing the situation now in our social institutions, I think AI could provide digital companions, which are maybe part of your own private cloud. It's not part of the platforms of the GAFTA companies. And they are acting like you because they are thinking like you. They learned about your preferences, your interests, your things you don't like, and therefore are helping you to navigate through your life. And even as a robot, so a physical one who can at least support the service in elderly residential institutions. Don't know the English term exactly, but anyway, so they can assist. We need also the communication with humans, because robots cannot do, but we would have such digital companions, I think, in a widespread.
How about the combination of synthetic biology and artificial intelligence? Do you think there are interesting applications? I mean, the cover story from The Economist this week was about synthetic biology and how we could, edit genes in real time and, have new possibilities to influence living forms on this planet. Do you see any combination maybe of, the biological and the, artificial?
Yeah, it's scary for me, to be honest. I'm not a big fan of it. In some domains I can imagine.
Why is it scary?
Well, it's, I think a human for me is something very special. It's made by the evolution over a certain time. And humans were always able to adapt to the given circumstances to survive as a species. And you can argue, of course, maybe we need this to survive in the future, to be a combined cyborg or whatever. I'm not so sure whether this is needed or not. But in medicine, for example, I can think of such applications to help people to survive.
Yeah, okay, so I usually think of, the possibilities of these scenarios like, developing better humans, which could take over complex decision-making, tasks, tasks that where human beings have so far had a very dismal record. If you look at the wars and environmental degradation and all that's happening, and what could argue that if you had, a better human being to entrust with this kind of complex decision making, it would be something good for the human race, for this planet in general. We're talking, of course, about 2050, 2060, maybe 2100, but...
Yeah, of course, very interesting question. But if you look at our society, we still have a divide. So I'm asking you, who should that be if you talk a human? Yeah, I think even in such cases, if I look at today's situation, we would have a selection. So we would have some privileged people who got a speedy something, ingredients to be better, whatever this means. We don't know about the side effects of such treatments, but I think it's another dimension of dividing the society, so therefore I'm a bit hesitating to support.
Okay. If you're interested in this scenario, by the way, I could only recommend watching the movie Appleseed, which is a Japanese animation, an excellent Japanese animation, which is exactly about this topic. Thank you very much, Professor Dengel. I often find myself wishing that I would have been born 50 years into the future, because a lot of the interesting stuff is just being developed right now, like also synthetic biology, robotics, artificial intelligence. All these fields are still in their infancy. But historians, of course, in 50 years might look back and laugh at the excitement that AI has generated, and they would say, okay, this is so simple, artificial intelligence, look at what we've achieved right now. But then I recognize that all the interesting applications that would be possible in the future would be only possible because of the groundwork that's being laid in the here and now. So we could laugh back at these historians, because without our work, their future wouldn't even be possible. And I think there is no better time to be alive than today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.